He was just a security guard. No one noticed him, no one asked his name, until one day he started speaking in 9 different languages. What happened next shocked the entire company. Watch until the end to see how one ordinary man turned the corporate world upside down. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that prove greatness hides in plain sight. And drop a comment, where are you watching from? Let's connect. Each morning, the headquarters of Stellanova Group in Boston awakened like a living machine, precise and unfeeling. It breathed in streams of professionals through its mirrored doors and exhaled them into elevators and open-plan offices where the rhythm of corporate life drummed in meetings, decisions, and inboxes bursting with urgency. Beneath the marble floors and glass facades, beneath the gleam of productivity and order, stood a man the building had learned to overlook. Jamal Evans was posted at the security podium just beyond the atrium, positioned at the confluence of motion where heels struck tile and conversations fizzed with caffeine. His uniform, always pressed, carried the scent of discipline. His posture was faultless, and his expression settled into a calm neutrality that never intruded and rarely invited. He was, by design or by circumstance, part of the infrastructure, as essential and as invisible as the support beams behind the walls. He had been there for years, nodding at the regulars, assisting the confused, and responding to every badge malfunction or directional request with quiet competence. No one asked his name, fewer remembered his face, yet every day he arrived before most, walked the perimeter, performed system checks, and settled into a day of silence and observation. It was a role that demanded presence without voice, and Jamal had perfected it. What no one knew, however, was that beneath that composed silence lived a mind in constant motion. Jamal didn't simply observe people, he listened, absorbed, and cataloged. While others blinked past him on their way to corner offices, he was absorbing languages through podcasts piped into a single earpiece, committing structures and cadences to memory, reciting conjugations under his breath during slow shifts. The security booth was his station, but his mind resided in Beijing, Rabat, Buenos Aires, Berlin. Language was his sanctuary, and learning had become a quiet rebellion against the assumption that his uniform defined his limit. That particular Monday unfolded with the same precision as every other. The sun climbed behind the skyline, bouncing off the tall panes of glass that wrapped the building like armor. Employees flowed in, some already on calls, some scanning key cards with one hand while sipping coffee with the other. Screens flickered, voices rose and fell. In the sea of tailored suits and brisk steps, Jamal stood motionless, his presence steady but unnoticed. Yet the rhythm fractured slightly that morning, almost imperceptibly. It began with a visitor, a middle-aged man scanning his surroundings in quiet confusion. His hands clutched a leather folder with the grip of someone afraid to lose it. His badge was missing, his destination unclear. Jamal noticed at once. While others would have dismissed the man's presence as an interruption to their momentum, Jamal's instincts activated. He stepped from behind the podium and offered assistance. Within seconds, the tone of the man's speech signaled familiarity with a dialect Jamal recognized intimately. Switching without effort, Jamal began communicating in the man's language, his voice calm, clear, unhurried. The visitor's posture softened. Relief flickered across his features. He departed toward the elevators with renewed confidence, the situation diffused before it had ever become a problem. Moments later, another moment presented itself. This time, a young couple locked in quiet dispute over directions. Jamal understood them instantly, not just because of their words, but the rhythm of their Spanish. Again, he transitioned smoothly, delivering instructions with precision, offering clarity without condescension. They thanked him. Their tension dissolved. Before the atrium had fully settled, another interaction emerged. A delivery person, grumbling in accented French, fumbled with mismarked boxes, irritation bubbling. Jamal listened, assessed, then intervened with the same poise, offering guidance in perfect French and redirecting the man to the correct department. Gratitude was immediate. 3 languages, 3 human interactions, 3 acts of seamless intervention, and not a single one had drawn attention, at least not from the passing crowd, but on the mezzanine above the lobby, someone had paused. Elaine Vanders, the CEO of Stellanova Group, had been en route to her office as usual. A woman accustomed to efficiency and predictability, she was rarely distracted. Her time was budgeted in minutes, her mind layered in strategies, expansion forecasts, and board-level concerns. Yet that morning, something broke her momentum. From her elevated vantage, she had watched the security guard, the one she had passed countless times without a second thought, respond to 3 unrelated issues with a quiet mastery that defied every expectation she held of his role. The shifts between languages were not mechanical, they were lived. There was no pause, no hesitation, no textbook translation. He embodied the communication. He anchored it. What struck her more than the fluency was the humility. The way he returned to his post, straightened his jacket, and resumed his position as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But something had, and she, for one, could not look away. Rather than continuing to her office, she descended the staircase with a curiosity that surprised even her. This wasn't strategy, this was instinct, the sense that she had just glimpsed something rare and unmeasured by spreadsheets. She approached him, and what followed, brief, calm, revelatory, would become the fulcrum upon which 2 very different lives would pivot. The next thing Jamal knew, he was standing in an elevator beside a woman whose name was on the building's shareholder letterhead. It was surreal, but he didn't flinch. As they ascended, he kept his breathing steady, his thoughts sharp. The past 5 years had conditioned him to remain still while the world around him moved. But this time, he was moving with it. When the elevator opened, he stepped into a floor he had never entered, through hallways designed to signal status, leather furniture, citrus-scented air, framed awards, the scent of money and achievement layered into every detail. He was led into an office bordered by glass, its walls reflecting a map of global influence. There were charts, coffee trays, a shelf with dusty trophies and neatly arranged family photos. It was a room built for power, but Jamal felt no intimidation. He had nothing to prove and everything to offer. The woman who sat across from him asked to hear his story, and so, for the first time in years, he told it. He spoke of Newark, of long nights listening to foreign broadcasts, of parents who pushed education like a sacred ritual, of a scholarship earned through obsession and discipline, and of how it all unraveled, not through failure, but through responsibility. He had been a linguistics student, on track for a career in international relations. Then his mother had fallen ill and his father had collapsed under the strain. He had abandoned his studies, moved home, and stepped into roles no 19-year-old should have to fill. Provider, nurse, guardian, brother. There was no bitterness in his telling, only truth. Each shift he had worked since, from overnight cashier to building security, had been for survival. But through it all, he had kept learning, secretly, fiercely, as though language was the last ember of his former self he refused to let die. When he finished, there was no fanfare, no applause, only a silence thick with understanding. The CEO didn't dismiss him, she didn't thank him and return to her emails. Instead, she made a decision. That afternoon, Jamal Evans, still wearing the same uniform he had worn that morning, found himself invited to assist in an upcoming high-level meeting with executives from Brazil. The company's translator had canceled unexpectedly. The meeting was too important to postpone. And she, it seemed, had made up her mind. Jamal didn't hesitate. In the hours that followed, he reviewed documents in Portuguese, familiarized himself with terminology, and prepared himself with the same quiet diligence he had practiced since his teens. When the moment came, he entered the meeting not as a guard, but as a facilitator, a bridge. What unfolded during those 30 minutes would become the first thread in a new tapestry. The visitors, initially skeptical, warmed to the presence of someone who not only understood their words, but their rhythm, their culture, their concerns. The atmosphere shifted. Engagement blossomed. By the time they left, handshakes were warm, and the meeting was called a success. No one outside that room fully understood what had taken place, but inside, a new chapter had begun. And for Jamal Evans, who had spent half a decade unseen, the world had just taken its first real look at him. The day following the unexpected meeting unfolded with the familiar hum of corporate rhythm, yet beneath the glossy surface of Stalinova Group's headquarters, something had changed. A subtle but undeniable shift in gravity, as if a once fixed point in the structure had moved. It was not an announced promotion, nor a headline in the internal newsletter. There were no emails heralding new beginnings. The change was quieter, softer, and, in a way, more permanent, the kind of change that begins not in policy, but in perception. Jamal Evans returned to the building the same way he always had, early, composed, quietly present. Yet something within him had shifted. The security uniform still fit the same, the badge clipped to the same belt loop, but it no longer felt like the full definition of who he was. The previous day's encounter had opened a door, not merely to an office, but to a conversation, one that had long been locked behind circumstances and silence. He resumed his post without ceremony. The guard station greeted him with its usual sterile comfort. The monitors blinked, the radios hissed softly, and the steady tide of professionals resumed their flow past him. Most walked by with their usual disinterest, but a few now offered nods that lingered half a second longer. One or two cast brief, curious glances, their eyes flickering with questions they were not yet ready to ask. Jamal noted it all, not with vanity, but with the awareness of someone trained by years of being ignored. Attention, however subtle, had weight, and now he carried it. Mid-morning, his routine was quietly interrupted by a call from the executive office. The CEO requested his presence. The formality of the message was nearly laughable to him. Just a day before, the very idea would have seemed absurd, yet now it felt like another step in something real. He checked the security logs, nodded to his colleague, and made his way to the elevator once more. The ascent was no longer foreign. The polished floors and muted lighting of the executive wing no longer felt like foreign soil. He entered the familiar glass-walled office, now more invitation than command. He was offered a chair, and as he settled in, the conversation shifted again, from curiosity to substance. What Elaine Vanders wanted that day was not simply to reflect on the previous success, but to understand, not just how Jamal spoke the languages he did, but how someone with so much depth had remained unnoticed in a company that prided itself on global vision. And so he told her more. He described the path in greater detail, not as a speech, but as a memory drawn slowly from places too long left untouched. His childhood had been defined not by luxury, but by love. His mother's gentle discipline, his father's quiet pride. Books were sacred, and learning was praised like virtue. Every evening he would sit with cassette tapes borrowed from the public library, rewinding lessons in Mandarin, French, and Arabic until the phrases imprinted themselves into his bones. In school, he was the quiet one, not withdrawn, but observant. Language became his secret superpower. While others fought through algebra, he memorized grammar rules in 6 different alphabets. He was offered scholarships early. Teachers pleaded with him to pursue international relations or diplomacy, and for a time, it seemed possible. At NYU, he had found his element. Surrounded by voices from every continent, he felt alive in a way he never had before. He dreamed of becoming a cultural liaison, perhaps even working for the United Nations. His grades soared and his professors took note, but the universe had a different script. The call had come one Thursday night. His mother had collapsed at the clinic where she worked. A stroke, sudden and devastating. She survived but lost her speech. Jamal didn't hesitate. He packed his life into a duffel bag and returned home. His father, already strained from work, grew thin under the weight of stress and grief. Jamal took over meals, therapy, transportation, financial management. NYU became a deferred dream. Then came the cancer. His father withered over 3 months, slipping through Jamal's fingers no matter how tightly he held on. After the funeral, there was no time to mourn. His younger sister was 13, disoriented by grief, retreating into silence. Bills mounted. He found work, any work, that paid steadily. Night shifts were best. They gave him space to be present for his sister by day. Security offered consistency, if not purpose. He found a position with Stellanova, then still a rising star in the logistics sector. It offered benefits, a fixed schedule, and, most importantly, anonymity. He wore the uniform like armor. He was never questioned, never challenged, and never truly seen. But Jamal never stopped learning. His nights were filled with whispered repetitions of Czech consonants, of Swahili structure, of dialectal differences in Portuguese. Podcasts whispered in his ear beneath the murmur of surveillance monitors. Newspapers in foreign languages became his textbooks. A stack of dictionaries, worn and well-loved, waited on his bedside table each morning when he came home. His sister began to joke that he was preparing to become a walking embassy. In truth, he was just clinging to the last part of himself that still dreamed. As Jamal shared this story with Elaine, the woman across from him did not interrupt. She didn't nod performatively or offer platitudes. She simply listened, fully, quietly, with the kind of respect that doesn't require explanation. And when he finished, something shifted in her expression. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The conversation turned to the future. There was an upcoming meeting with Stellanova's Brazilian division. Their top translator had canceled due to illness, and the delegation was arriving ahead of schedule. It was too late to find a replacement. Elaine looked at Jamal not with hope, but with certainty. She asked him if he would be willing to help. He accepted with the same calm that had become his signature. Not from arrogance, he had nothing to prove, but from preparation. This, he realized, was the moment he had unknowingly trained for across 100 sleepless nights. He returned to his apartment that afternoon and pulled out his notes in Portuguese. Pages filled with colloquialisms, industry terminology, and common pitfalls. He reviewed for hours, ensuring he would not falter. The next morning, he arrived early, dressed not in uniform but in a pressed button-down and simple slacks. He wasn't polished in the way of the boardroom, but his posture spoke volumes. When the Brazilian executives entered the conference room, Jamal was already seated. The CEO introduced him not as a security guard, but as a facilitator. The guests glanced at him with the benign skepticism that followed all sudden substitutions, and then he spoke. He introduced himself with clarity, his Portuguese measured and regionally attuned. There was no stiffness, no hint of translation fatigue. His voice carried ease, confidence, humanity. The meeting that followed was one of the smoothest Stellanova had hosted that quarter. The Brazilians laughed, asked questions, leaned in. Jamal didn't simply interpret, he channeled tone and nuance, capturing intent as much as vocabulary. Where others might have focused on grammar, he focused on meaning. The atmosphere lightened. A tentative partnership began to form. By the time the meeting concluded, one of the guests turned to Elaine and made a comment, not about the logistics or the numbers, but about Jamal himself. They asked where she had found him. She didn't answer in detail. She didn't need to. After the meeting, Jamal quietly began clearing cups and documents. Old habits die hard. But Elaine stopped him, not with words, but with a gesture. "Not today," the gesture said. "Not anymore." As he left the executive floor that afternoon, the elevator ride down felt different, lighter, though his body was heavier with realization. Something had begun, something fragile and new and terrifying. He had been noticed. He had been heard, but being seen was only the beginning. Because the world he was stepping into, the one he had long watched from the margins, did not always welcome those who arrived through unorthodox doors. And tomorrow, he would learn just how deep those thresholds ran. In the days that followed Jamal's unexpected emergence into the upper corridors of Stellanova, the building itself seemed to breathe differently. The lights flickered as they always had, the escalators hummed, the elevators chimed politely at each floor. But beneath the surface of this glass and steel corporate organism, something invisible began to vibrate. Change, when it enters an ecosystem, is rarely announced. It leaks first through silence, through glances, through the ripple of uncertainty on familiar waters. Jamal did not return to his security podium. Instead, he arrived the following Monday through the same front doors, but was guided not to the surveillance monitors or the corridor of cleaning crews. Instead, he was led to a modest office on the 12th floor. It bore his name on the wall beside the door, Coordinator of International Engagement. The title felt both monumental and weightless. It was more than he'd ever allowed himself to imagine, and yet less than the fullness of what he carried inside him. He stepped into the room not with pride, but with reverence. The desk was unadorned. The chair was standard. A single window offered a narrow glimpse of the city skyline. But to Jamal, the space felt as vast as the world he had studied from the shadows. It wasn't long before the shift drew attention. Whispers spread through departments like wildfire, wrapped in velvet. They slid between conversations in kitchens, appeared in Slack threads disguised as curiosity, were folded into long silences between keystrokes. Some employees expressed cautious admiration. Others masked their envy behind brittle smiles. There were theories, jokes, and questions. Some spoke his name for the first time. Others still referred to him as the guard who got lucky. But Jamal paid little attention. He arrived each morning before most, reviewed briefs in multiple languages, assisted with correspondence from international offices, and prepared for a second major test, a diplomatic delegation from Morocco, part of a long-stalled expansion effort that had collapsed under the weight of cultural miscommunication and corporate tone deafness. The meeting had been rescheduled half a dozen times. Now it rested, quietly, in Jamal's hands. He approached the assignment as he had all others, quietly, rigorously, methodically. He reviewed previous correspondence, highlighted mistranslations, and researched the visiting delegates. He immersed himself not only in the Moroccan dialect of Arabic, but in its gestures, traditions, and unspoken expectations. The rhythm of conversation, the order of introductions, the untranslatable meaning behind a glance or silence. When the day came, he wore a beige blazer, simple, well-fitted, borrowed from a cousin. His shoes were shined with the same care he once gave to polishing his badge. He stood at the entrance to the executive conference room with calm posture and a gaze that neither invited nor avoided attention. The Moroccan delegation arrived with guarded expressions and slow steps. Their body language carried years of unmet expectations. Jamal greeted them in flawless dialect. His voice was warm but composed, his tone neither overly familiar nor stiffly formal. Within minutes, the atmosphere softened. Small talk emerged. Laughter, faint but genuine, bloomed in the pauses. Inside the meeting, Jamal did more than translate. He curated, he bridged, he mediated not just language, but trust. What had previously been barriers became shared spaces. Misunderstandings dissolved before they took root. Concerns, voiced clearly, were acknowledged and addressed. For the first time in a year, a viable path forward took shape. When the meeting concluded, one of the senior Moroccan delegates offered a gesture, hand to chest, eyes lowered briefly, a silent thank you that meant far more than any document. Jamal responded with equal sincerity, then quietly left the room. The feedback was immediate. Elaine, standing just outside the conference room, understood at once what had occurred. She had watched the posture of the guests as they left. The open shoulders, the easy smiles, the absence of tension. She didn't need to speak Jamal's languages to recognize success. But success, however clear to some, rarely travels unchallenged. Later that afternoon, Jamal received a message requesting his presence in a small meeting room on the 17th floor, one rarely used except for closed-door conversations. When he entered, he was met by a woman whose presence seemed to recalibrate the air itself. Ingrid Marsh, long-standing member of the board, renowned for her precision and her tone sharper than most contracts. The room was bare, no refreshments, no assistant, just a folder on the table, her hands crossed neatly atop it. What followed was not a conversation, but an interrogation wrapped in formality. She reviewed his file, or rather its absence. No degree, no formal training in corporate strategy, no certifications. She asked questions not to understand, but to unearth contradiction. She spoke of process, of tradition, of proper channels. She questioned his elevation, his qualifications, even his presence in the building beyond the first floor. Jamal did not react. He listened, and when his turn came, he answered calmly. He spoke of outcomes, of the contracts he'd already corrected, of the negotiations he had salvaged, of the bridges he had built in languages most executives couldn't pronounce. He did not defend himself. He simply presented the truth. And when she fell silent, it was not because she agreed. It was because there was nothing left to contest. The meeting ended without ceremony, but it marked the beginning of something else. That evening, as Jamal returned to his office, he noticed an envelope resting on his keyboard. It bore no logo, no name, just his own written in careful block letters. Inside was a simple piece of paper. No speech, no gift card, just 13 handwritten words. I used to think I was invisible. Today, I stood straighter. Thank you. He sat back in his chair, the paper in his hands, and exhaled slowly. He did not know who had written it, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The message was a mirror, a ripple, a signal that his presence had become more than a symbol. It had become a catalyst. 2 days later, Elaine made a quiet decision. No fanfare, no newsletter, no speech. The company's main employee training auditorium, where every new hire began their Stella Nova journey, had long been nameless. She had a small plaque installed. It read simply, "The Evans Room." Because talent doesn't always wear a title. The reaction was mixed. Some cheered quietly, others rolled their eyes, a few laughed, thinking it was a temporary gesture, but none could ignore it. Jamal continued his work. He mentored interns who felt unseen. He helped international departments rewrite internal policies. He uncovered translation errors in long-standing documents that had cost the company hundreds of thousands in misunderstandings. He brought consistency to confusion, and more importantly, he brought dignity where there had been none. One afternoon, a shy intern, an international student named Bao, approached his desk with a question. Jamal welcomed him with the same warmth he gave the executives. When the intern hesitated, Jamal handed him a list of resources and offered encouragement. The young man returned to his desk with his head a little higher. Elaine watched all this quietly, from corners of rooms, from behind glass doors. She saw the pattern forming. People gravitated toward Jamal not for answers alone, but for steadiness, for the quiet affirmation that they, too, might be more than their email signature or their lack of title. In time, she approached him with an idea, a seed for a program that could grow within the company's vast, often impersonal architecture. A program not based on hierarchy, but on potential. Not on degrees, but on grit. Not on visibility, but on vision. Jamal agreed. Together, they developed what would be called the Internal Voices Initiative, a framework to identify, nurture, and elevate talent hidden in plain sight. The program offered access to language education, leadership workshops, and internal mobility. It wasn't just a policy, it was a redefinition. Within 3 months, the program launched quietly, no press release, no gala, just an email, an invitation. Enrollment filled in a week. Employees from custodial teams, security, kitchen staff, and maintenance applied, some with resumes no one had ever seen, some with stories no one had ever asked about. And for the first time, the overlooked began to feel the walls of the company bend toward them. At the year-end logistics summit in Chicago, Jamal was invited to speak. He did not deliver a motivational speech. He told a story. His story, not of triumph, but of survival, of learning in the margins, of refusing to let silence define him. He ended with a simple observation that greatness is not always loud nor adorned with titles. Sometimes it wears a uniform and listens more than it speaks. Sometimes it watches for years before it's seen. As he stepped off the stage, a young man in the audience, the son of a janitor, stood and whispered to his neighbor that maybe, just maybe, he belonged here too. And so, Jamal Evans became more than a name on a plaque. He became proof. That talent does not always rise. Sometimes it waits. And when seen, it doesn't just shine, it transforms everything around it. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. because there are so many more untold stories waiting to be heard. Like the video, share it with someone who needs inspiration today. And let us know in the comments, have you ever felt unseen? Your story matters. We see you.